Good morning, Richard. My name is John Bonifaz, President of Free Speech for People. Thank you for joining this conversation. I want to introduce you. Richard Painter is the professor of law at University of Minnesota Law School. He's the former chief White House ethics counsel under President George W. Bush, and he has spoken extensively about the need to defend our democracy, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Thank you, Richard, for joining this conversation.
Thank you for having me, John.
So I want to start off, Richard, with the Comey indictment and your view of it as an abuse of power and an impeachable offense.
Selective prosecution is a hallmark of dictatorships. When the Justice Department is used by the head of state to prosecute his political enemies, that is a method, a common method of silencing dissent and preventing anyone from challenging the head of state. This is what happens in Putin's Russia. You challenge Vladimir Putin, you end up getting charged for some crime and sent off to Siberia. It's happened to billionaires in Russia who go crossways with Vladimir Putin. This is not acceptable. We cannot allow it in the United States. The Justice Department is not there to prosecute the enemies of the President of the United States. The Justice Department is there to even-handedly enforce the law.
Thank you. And what do you see as the need now in terms of moving this forward in the Congress? What is necessary?
The U.S. House, Senate, and the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees should convene hearings, just as they did in the Watergate scandal. But this time, the focus needs to be first and foremost on abuse of power in the U.S. Department of Justice. We've had multiple United States attorneys in various districts being roped into political vendettas against the president's enemies and efforts to assist the president's political party through criminal investigations and prosecutions. This is unacceptable. The Attorney General should be called to testify and explain herself and what's going on here. All the communications between the White House and any of the prosecutors involved in these cases need to be exposed so the American people can see how the Justice Department is being used. And then the House and the Senate, after the investigation, can consider the evidence and think about whether there are grounds to impeach the Attorney General of the United States, the President of the United States, or both.
And what role do you see shadow hearings playing in this process, given that there is the potential there are not the votes now to start those hearings in the House or Senate? What role can shadow hearings held by one political party in the minority do for moving this forward?
Well, it's going to be very unfortunate if we can't approach the question of abuse of power by the president in a bipartisan manner. So I think the Democrats can certainly have shadow hearings if they so choose. But I think the demand here needs to be made on all of the members of the House and the Senate, including the Republicans, to have hearings and find out what's going on. Everyone ought to be committed to doing that. And then if there's disagreement about whether the threshold has been reached for impeachment of either the Attorney General or the President, those disagreements can be expressed in the committee hearing room as they were in the Watergate hearings. And so it's so important that we approach this in a bipartisan manner. If Republicans will not get on board, will not even have hearings, then that needs to be an issue that's brought to the voters to consider. Because that's very, very troubling. We have enough evidence here of abuse of power in the Justice Department that full committee hearings in the House and Senate need to be convened immediately.
And can you speak to why the framers placed the impeachment clause in the Constitution and why you think it applies to this situation today?
The impeachment clause allows the House and the Senate to remove a president or any other officer of the United States government who is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. And this would include abuse of power. The impeachment clause does not require that the violation of a specific criminal statute be proven. The definition of bribery for purposes of impeachment is significantly broader than the criminal statute prohibiting bribery. Someone could be impeached for bribery in a circumstance where they couldn't necessarily be criminally convicted under the much narrower, more focused statute. This is the power given to the House and the Senate by the framers because of the fear of abuse of executive power or abuse of judicial power, because judges and justices also can be impeached and have been in the past. And this is the duty of the House and the Senate to convene hearings, to investigate abuse of power in the executive branch when they see it. And that is the first step toward impeachment if the evidence is there to support impeachment. Well, without the hearings, the Congress can't find out. And the Congress isn't doing its job if they don't convene hearings in this situation.
Thank you. And can we turn now to the emoluments clause and what you see happening there with respect to potential violations?
The framers in the Constitution specifically prohibited anyone holding a position of trust with the United States government from receiving a gift, a title, or emoluments. And emoluments means profits or advantages from a foreign government. And that would include an entity controlled by a foreign government, such as a sovereign wealth fund. What this means is that anyone holding a position of trust with the United States government shouldn't be doing business deals with foreign governments. You can't have the president of the United States owning a controlling share in a cryptocurrency firm and then have a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East investing a lot of money in that cryptocurrency firm. That's a violation of the Emoluments Clause. Once again, Congress needs to enforce the Emoluments Clause by convening hearings and finding out if any people holding positions of trust with the United States government, anyone, the president, the treasury secretary, anyone else, is receiving profits and benefits from foreign governments in violation of the United States Constitution. If so, and if there's substantial emoluments in violation of the Constitution, this also could be an impeachable offense.
Thank you. And then finally, with respect to the president's decision to send the U.S. military into U.S. cities, can you comment on that as a question of abuse of power and an impeachable offense?
The Posse Comitatus Act, passed by Congress in the 1870s, prohibits the use of the United States military for domestic law enforcement purposes. And this was a response to the aftermath of the Civil War when the Union Army was being used for law enforcement throughout the South. And compromises were reached where the decision was made that the Union troops would be withdrawn. It would no longer be engaged in law enforcement. And this has been the law in the United States ever since. It is prohibited for the federal troops, and that includes the National Guard under the command of the President of the United States, as opposed to the National Guard under the command of the governor. It is prohibited for federal troops to be used for domestic law enforcement. There are very few exceptions where Congress has authorized the use of federal troops domestically. For example, if they really have to go in and protect federal agents in the performance of their duties because the federal agents don't have significant force to protect themselves, you could use a limited number of troops for that under Title 10. If there really is an insurrection like the Civil War or something, an Insurrection Act would provide the president with some power. But an insurrection is the real deal, not just a big protest that just turns violent somewhere. An example of an insurrection might be what happened on January 6th. And ironically, President Trump has pardoned the insurrectionists there. Or someone tries to overthrow the government, attacking the Capitol building. And so there are some circumstances where deployment of troops is allowed, but we haven't seen nothing that would justify, for example, sending federal troops to Portland, Oregon, or to Los Angeles. And the Trump administration has already lost the case brought against him by the governor of California over the deployment in Los Angeles. This needs to stop.
So, what do you see as the danger if Congress does not invoke the impeachment power and does not hold these hearings that you're calling for? What's the ultimate danger to the country, to the Constitution, and the rule of law?
The danger is that the abuses of power become worse and worse. If you allow an abuse of power in one instance and it goes unchecked, then later on you'll have even greater abuses of power. until you don't have a democracy anymore. Take, for example, the deployment of troops for domestic law enforcement purposes to quell civil unrest and protests and that type of thing. Germany went through this with the Weimar Constitution in the 1920s and early 1930s, and there's a specific provision, Article 48, that prohibited deployment of troops for this type of purpose without the consent of a state, except for under certain circumstances, it would be authorized if there was an effect equivalent of an emergency with the consent of the legislature would be permitted. And what happened in 1932 was the president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, figured a way around this provision, Article 48 of the Constitution, to deploy troops into Prussia to put down a riot. There was unrest in the streets between communists and Nazis, and did so against the will of the government of Prussia. And the government of Prussia brought a lawsuit, went all the way up to the German Supreme Court in Reich versus Prussia, and the court allowed the deployment of the troops with some restrictions, but they allowed too much. And the president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, the very next year replaced the chancellor and appointed a new chancellor, Adolf Hitler, who within months used the same strategy to deploy troops all over the entire country after a fire at the Reichstag building. Once again, abusing the power, violating the Constitution, set off forth in for Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, and democracy was destroyed in a matter of months. So if you allow it once, the problem is you could get someone in there later who really does want to become a dictator. And so we could argue about Donald Trump and what we think about Donald Trump. Oh, gee, is he want to make himself a dictator? That's not the point. The point is, if you allow one president to do this and you don't draw the line and enforce the Constitution, enforce the laws in the United States, we're going to have someone down the line, it could be a Democrat or a Republican, who says, well, I'm just going to go that next step. And that's what destroyed democracy in Germany. That's what could destroy democracy in the United States if we don't enforce our Constitution. And that's why the House and the Senate need to convene hearings and look at abuse of power, particularly in the Justice Department and in the military. Those are the two most dangerous areas for abuse of power, where democracies have been turned into dictatorships through abuse of power in the Justice Ministry and in the military. And we need to investigate now and draw the line and make it very, very clear to any president that that line cannot be crossed.
Thank you, Richard. My last question is to answer the critics who say, well, Donald Trump has been impeached twice. We need to move on from the impeachment process. We should not be talking about impeachment anymore. What do you say to all that?
Well, impeachment is in the Constitution. And the elected representatives of people need to hold the president accountable, and that includes sometimes the president of their own party. And I should emphasize, we might not be in this situation if Democrats have been willing to stand up to Joe Biden and his desire to have a second term. I mean, he violated the law with respect to the classified documents. And whether he should have been impeached or at least persuaded not to run for a second term after those documents were discovered, and it had a real primary, we might not be in this jam with Donald Trump back in office again. So both parties need to learn to understand how important it is for the members of Congress not to be subordinate to the president of the United States, simply covering for the president no matter what is happening. The role of the Congress is to stand up to the president, and that includes the president of your own political party when that president is making very bad decisions. Whether it's Joe Biden running again, which was not criminal at all, they just threw away an election with that foolishness, or in this case, abuse of power by President Donald Trump.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you very much for having me.